We're back with more Unreal 2D development. Last time we got started with setting up sprites and a sprite animation, and this time we're going to give this guy a world to live in. We're going to make a tile map for him to inhabit and just have some fun with all of that. So, as I showed in the last video, we have this grassland terrain tile set here. There's a link down below in the description. All of these are free assets that I'm using just for like educational purposes. But if we open this up, I think we still need to set this to be properly scaled because it's all kinds of blurry. So let's go into the texture group here and set this to 2D pixels so that it's all sharp and pixelized. And then instead of making a sprite out of this, which we don't want to do, what we're going to do instead is we're going to create a tile set. If we want to make a tile map, we first need a tile set to pick tiles from to populate a tile map with. We'll get into the tile map in a moment. First, create a tile set, and this will have a handful of settings to go with it. So you can just click anywhere on the screen, and that will show you the tiles that you're picking. But these, of course, are not exactly the tiles that we want. So we want to set the tile size to the correct number, which in this case, I'm guessing is going to be 16 by 16. And it is, and this will let you select the individual tiles properly. If your tiles have any spacing in between, sometimes in the tile map you might have that, you can set it to like your per tile spacing, and there will be, if I just make this 10 and 10, you will see that I don't click in between here because it's assuming that, hey, there's going to be 10 pixels between every single tile. In this case, obviously, that's not the case. We have them all connecting up to each other. So it's just going to be 0 and 0, and this lets me select all of the individual tiles. And that really is kind of the only majorly important thing about creating a tile set, aside from adding in collision to all of your tiles. So for any given tile, what you can do is you can add some collision. So for this, for instance, I can just simply add a box up here. You can do that because it's just a box. For tiles like this with a little bit of a rounded corner, it's more or less up to what you prefer. You can just add a box and it'll probably be fine. If you want this to be a little bit more rounded, what you can do instead is do add polygon and manually draw in the collision around your box. This, of course, is a fair bit more work, but if you really care about this rounded corner here, and once you're done drawing, you can just press enter. It will now have a more accurate collision box to this area. For the most part though, I think just adding in a box is fine. If you want to see which tiles have collision already, you can click on this colliding tiles thing, and that will show you what collision all of your tiles have. So I'm just going to add a box to pretty much like all of these, because effectively all of this needs to have collision. You can select multiple with click and drag at a time, but that does get rid of all of the collision related things. So you do need to add these one at a time, sadly. This is one of those things where you can start seeing that, yes, Unreal does have these 2D tools, but they are maybe a little bit less user-friendly in some cases, and maybe sometimes if you have a programmer on your team that can deal with this, making an extension on this editor which would allow you to do things a little bit more like you would want them to do can be very much beneficial. Whereas in an engine like Unity or maybe even GameMaker or Godot, all this kind of stuff is generally like easily done for you as far as like 2D stuff goes. So for things like these slopes, obviously, that is where I do go in and draw my collision fairly custom, because this does need to just straight up be a triangle. And it's not the most exact science in the world, but you want it to match like fairly closely, I would say. If you notice that you misplaced any of these polygon points, by the way, after you complete the collision itself, make sure to disable grid snapping if it is on. And then just clicking on any of these points, you get a little gizmo to move it back around more into the place that you want it to be. You can do this for entire sides as well. And then for these, I might also do a little bit of extra like geometry for the collision. Nothing too exact and complex, of course, but just something so that it has a little bit more of that rounding going on, to be honest. because it might feel kind of annoying if you touch up against this little bit of air. Like for these corners that are just 3 pixels big, I'm not really worried about that. For this, which is mostly air, I do think it is probably good to do that, but I'm not going to do that for this entire thing at this point, because I don't even think we're going to be using this tile set in this series. But you can also start with a box, and in cases like this, just like move this down a little bit. And for things like these sides, that's probably good enough. You don't need to go through and make like entire like custom polygons for all those. So now that all these have their collision, at least like very rough collision, we can start using these for an actual tile map. So going back in here, I'm going to go back into my content, and we're actually going to make, before we do anything else, I'm going to make a new level. So we can go into File, New Level, and I'm just going to do this as an empty level. So not an empty open world level, just an empty level. Nothing will be in it, because we don't really need anything to be in it, to be honest with you. So let's save this level as well, immediately as a 2D level. You'll be able to see there's nothing in here, so entirely empty. We'll also make a new paper 2D tile map, and we'll call this something like level 1. If we open this up, we get this tile map editor. I'm actually going to go into my editor preferences real quick, and I have set that up to be a little bit bigger for the sake of the YouTube video in the scale. Going to set that down a little bit more because there's a lot of stuff going on here, so I want it to be a little bit more zoomed out. So in here we can see what tile set we are using. If you have multiple tile sets, you can switch between them with this icon up here. I only have the one, of course, at the moment, and we can start like selecting tiles and putting them in. It doesn't automatically. This is kind of weird, and one of those things where I'm like, it's not quite a polished system. It doesn't automatically match the size of the tile that you select here. What you need to do is you need to come over into your setup and set your tile width and size to the proper amount, because that is a property of the actual tile map asset, and it doesn't really like take it from the tile set. As you can see, when I make this bigger or smaller, it actually increases or decreases the size of the tile map as a whole, because it is set up to be X amount of tiles wide and high with X amount of pixels per tile. So the tile map width and height, the width you can play around with fairly easily. The height is quite important that you get that right from the start, and I'll show you why in a second. So I'm going to set this to about 32 high, and then let's say that this is 128 wide. So that'll be our level. And the reason that that is important is if we come back in here and we drag this into the level, it's all well and good. It starts at the top leftmost cell. And when I make something taller, so if I go back in here and I say, actually, I want this to be, let's draw something in for context's sake. I want this to be 64 high. It adds it to the bottom, not to the top. So that means that your level now has like extra stuff below everything that you've already drawn in, which is, in my opinion, probably not what you usually want. If you're adding extra heights, you probably want to be able to add it to the top. Ideally, it would center out in the middle, and you can just expand it to either the top or the bottom, or the left or the right. It's just not how it works. It just takes it from the center position of the top leftmost tile, and that'll be the world position of your tile map. It's just kind of how it works. We have to deal with it, unfortunately. I'm going to go back to 32 for this one. So from here, just kind of works as you would expect a tile map to work. You can select your tiles, and then you can like start drawing things in with the normal painter brush, and that works exactly as you would expect. You also have this fill buckets, which of course works to fill out parts of your areas. Do be sure to switch back to painting. They all have shortcuts. We have an eraser under E, fill bucket is G, and the paint tool is B for some reason. Now, there's no system for intelligent tile picking where it just chooses like edge tiles when it's on the edge, and these inside tiles when it's on the inside. You have to do that manually. However, what you can do is you can hold Shift and left click drag to kind of make like a stamp that you can easily copy over. And now let's erase these. And now we have like the basics of like this platforming level, right? So that's a little bit of a saving grace, but it's not great. I'll be the first to admit. So let's copy some more of these over. This will just be our level, just jumping from side to side to side to side. And there we go. Now, let's add a background next. Actually, no. Now, these tiles have their own collision. So if we scroll into the details panel to the bottom, we can see the collision thickness. This is how far the collision extends to the left and the right. You might be thinking, what does that matter? Well, this might be 2D, but Unreal's physics system and everything about Unreal Engine still functions in 3D. Right, so if we look around, like this is a 2D tile map and it exists, and we have like all the tiles and the sprites that we're using. They are entirely flat. They don't have any width. If we look at them exactly from the side, you effectively can't see them, but it still exists in a 3D world, and your character's still going to have 3D collision. The navigation is still going to be, if you have AI navigation, still all going to be using 3D nav meshes. Everything still functions as a 3D game. So this collision needs a little bit of thickness to work on. And a collision thickness of 50 usually is fine. That means that it extends 50 units in either direction. And usually this collision thickness of 50 is fine. If you need a nav mesh for your characters that need to like navigate, the thing is, you probably don't need a nav mesh in most cases if it's entirely 2D. But if you do, you might need to make it a little bit thicker because the Unreal nav mesh volume might not recognize that thin of a collision strip. So setting this in that case to something like 100 might be a little bit better. But for the time being, 50 works. And we effectively like have the start of our level now. Let's add a new layer to this as well, because that's an important part of setting up these levels. Now, the upside of Unreal being a 3D engine primarily is that it does make it very easy to create layered parallaxing, where the background moves at like a different speed to the foreground as you move through the level, because that is just how 3D perspective works. So we can take advantage of that by creating a new layer. Let's make a new layer here and say that it's on the bottom. We have a setting here where we have a separation per layer. By default, that's only set to 4, which is quite small. Let's just make a layer that, let's see, with entirely just this. It's a little ugly, but it'll do for now. If you go back into the level and we look at it from the side, we can see that these layers are, camera speed a little lower, please. We can see that these layers are separated by a couple of units. So as I move, you can see maybe that the foreground is moving a little bit at a different speed to the background because the background is slightly further away. We can increase this separation to something like maybe 25 to make this effect a lot more pronounced. And as you can see now, you can definitely tell that they are moving at different speeds due to the parallaxing effect. And this is automatically added for every layer in your system. So we can add like another layer in between. So this is the entire like far away background. So we can just right click and rename to background. And then maybe we have like an in-between layer where we put down a couple of these like rocks. And that will be in the middle. And then the background, maybe what we can do is we can like paint some like windows in it. But those are on separate layers. So like the boulder will move at a slightly different speed if we just go like this to the background itself as we move left and right. And then we can even add a like proper background where we can use this blue to just like be a like day sky background or whatever. So now we can just, with the background layer selected, do our like click and drag thing, and now we can fairly easily put these windows in. It doesn't copy over empty spaces, sadly, so you still do need to go through and erase those manually. Or you can just like fill buckets, an empty tile into there, and at that point it will actually copy them over. So that's a nice little trick. If you explicitly make something an empty tile, you can still copy it over. So that's quite like nice to be able to do. And that's the basic idea behind all of these tilemap things. So playing with tilemaps can be a lot of fun. We still don't really have anything to control our character with. So I think next time we'll set up the basics of actually making a character with 2D controls, and we'll be using the PaperZD plugin for some basic implementation of animation maybe. And a very big thank you to all my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help support the channel or get any of the project files in any of my tutorials, there's a link down below to the Patreon page to support me, or alternatively as a YouTube member. And of course, an extra massive thank you to my Cave Digger tier supporters, Sir J. Thomas,